Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. How is everyone doing out there in podcast land? Took last week off. Our cat, Prembly, passed away last Thursday, and maybe you can see why I didn't feel like putting together an episode, but I am very excited, even though I'm still deeply sad, and Naomi and I are just kind of walking around the apartment like specters. I was excited to put out today's episode. This is one of my favorite new artists, Isabel Olive, aka Half Gringa, and if you don't know who she is, I'm going to read you her bio right now. Originally from Carbondale, Illinois, musician Isabel Olive has been playing as Half Gringa, a nod to a childhood term of endearment as La Gringa, in her Venezuelan family and her bicultural experience growing up in the United States since the late 20-teens. Her first album, Gringa, I apologize, I took German and Latin in high school. I should have probably taken Spanish. So if I'm not pronouncing this correctly, please forgive me. Gringa was released in 2017 and her second, Forced to Reckon, in 2020. Earlier this year, she released the Ancestral Home EP, and this summer she'll be on tour supporting Iron and Wine. You can't go wrong with any of her albums. You honestly can't. They're all great. I found out about Isabel because former guest Victoria Vark tweeted about her, and I checked out Forced to Reckon, and I don't know, this is maybe a year or two ago. I can't remember exactly, but I've been listening to it ever since. It's been part of the rotation. And what a great conversation we have. Isabel's really cool, really thoughtful. Talking about growing up in Illinois, her Venezuelan mom, kind of what all this meant, especially in a post-9/11, bloodthirsty America, anti-immigrant milieu. So yeah, I hope you like this episode, and I hope you check out Isabel's music. By the way, if this is your first episode of Beginnings, thank you for checking out the show. And what I like to do here in the beginning is a little recommended if you like. I've been doing the show for 13 years, so the back catalog is a little daunting. So if you like today's guest, Isabel, if you like her music, maybe you'll like my talks with other indie rock musicians, such as, well, just recently, I've talked to Carl Newman from the New Pornographers, Rachel Brown from Thanks for Coming and Water from Your Eyes, Satomi Matsuzaki of Deerhoof, Oren Ambarchi, wonderful experimental jazz musician, and that's just recently. Like I said, 13 years. If you like what you hear and you want to check out other episodes beyond these, subscribe to the show. Please do that wherever you get your podcasts from. But I've talked to people not just from the world of music and indie rock and jazz, but, you know, writers and TV writers and actors and comedians and artists and thinkers. So honestly, 90% of the episodes are good. Actually, I don't know about the first year or two. I don't know. Maybe they're probably at least interesting. Anyway, what else for you? You can find me on social media. I don't know why you would want to be on Twitter, but I'm still just trying to write jokes there. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, I guess. I don't know. But I'm Andy Beckerman at all of those things. And coming up next week, Jay Holtham, wonderful comic book and TV writer, currently writing the Bishop miniseries over at Marvel. John Grant. That was a great talk. We chatted with a 7 or 8 hour time difference. He's in Iceland, and that was a really cool talk. So stay tuned for those. But for now, let's talk to Isabel. Not to plunge us into a cynical whirlwind, but that is pretty much the entirety of the modern world at the moment. So it's not that I'm complacent. I'm a striking WGA writer. So
right. Oh my God. Yeah. I have some friends that are also striking. Dang. How is the vibe in Los Angeles right now?
Weird, but yeah, the vibe's weird everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
I was trying to figure out like how to characterize the vibe exactly, because everything does feel off and weird, and I think it's uncanny. Like, do you ever like read Freud or anything like that? Anything
Not
like
recently.
that. This is his term. I don't know why I'm being so oddly ambiguous. He had a term called the uncanny, which basically is like something that's familiar but just slightly off, and that slightly offness is dreadful and terrifying.
Right. The uncanny valley kind of feeling. Right. Yeah.
And all of reality is like that right now. It's familiar. Like, we all know that this is the life that we've been leading, but it's all like between COVID denialism and kind of just like the encroaching police state and all this other kind of, all the other kinds of things that are going on. We're like, well, this is our normal life, but a man was choked to death on the New York subway, and no one did anything around it. And I'm just like, well, that's not what, when I lived in New York, no one did that. So it's just slightly off.
Yeah. Everything seems to be getting somehow even more fucked up than before, which feels crazy. For sure.
I mean, you're younger than me, I think. And I'm curious, you grew up, like, how old were you, like, around 9/11?
I was 10 in 9/11. I was born in 1991.
So I don't know if you remember before then, but like there was enough, you like formed enough of your personality before that like in the like things were kind of like, I grew up in the 80s and the 90s. I was a teenager, and everything was just kind of just like flat culturally, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And then
definitely.
And then it got weird. 9/11 and then the 2008 crash, I think, were like the two big things that kind of just like, all right, we're done with this flatness. Everything's just going to be unhinged from now on.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I definitely felt a difference. Yeah, especially because my mom's an immigrant. And so, like, she had just gotten naturalized as a citizen literally right before 9/11. It was like the spring of 2001, I think. And so, yeah, it just like the stark contrast of like going through an airport, or just like even just sort of like the feeling in communities and neighborhoods was like really, yeah, I could definitely sense a difference even as a 10-year-old. It was wild.
How did you adjust? Because at least I was an adult. I mean, I was, 20 something, 22 maybe. I had some kind of capacities.
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious how you adjusted to just everything becoming crazy.
Well, I guess like there was just a lot of contrast, and I think there is today too. Like when I was 10 and 11, like, and I was sort of forming my sense of like what the world is like, and sort of discovering, political opinions or like moral opinions for the first time, really. But there was a lot of like I mean, if you're that age, there's a lot of stuff being marketed at you constantly. And so, like, I think I was really into pop music, like a lot of people, like Britney Spears, NSYNC, Backstreet Boys, like this sort of like Y2K kind of aesthetic. And so, like, I don't know. I
spent
spent a lot
of. Second?
Yeah.
What is the Y2K aesthetic?
Like, imagine those like blow up chairs that they would sell at Claire's. That's immediately what I think of, like low rise jeans and blow up chairs that are made of this like neon plastic. Mm-hmm. So there was sort of this sort of like futuristic vibe. And I definitely think that was a theme for me of like thinking like the future is going to be better. And like, of course, I really did think that for a long time. I still kind of think that, but like, I remember being like, no, this is bad, but the future will get better. And like then Obama became president. That was like a huge part of my high school experience, like I just felt like, and then, gay marriage became legalized at the end of the time that I was in college. And I was just sort of like, no, it's going to be better. And then 2016 election, I was like, oh, maybe things won't be better. Maybe things will get worse, And having that first realization as like an adult was intense. But I think that was it for me. I was just sort of like, things are bad. Like I knew the Iraq War is bad. George Bush is bad. Like that was sort of the like 10-year-old, sort of, I don't have that much information that's, available to me. This is what I'm reading from my parents and the reactions of the people around me. Things will get better. It was just sort of like, I don't know, a little bit like cartoonish, but I just didn't know enough about the world at that point to know what the vibe was going to be.
I mean, at least at the time, your parents had, you were getting like, this is fucked up from your parents.
Yeah.
As opposed to like the general culture, if I remember correctly, was bloodthirsty.
Yeah.
There were a lot of anti-war people, and there was a giant anti-war march. I remember that. And then it amounted to everyone was just like, everyone in the political class was just like, fuck off. And they really Logan Roy'd it. Fuck off.
Yeah.
And then they did what they wanted, which was destroy another country. But yeah. And I guess, yeah, it's just weird in my mind to like, if I'm trying to like put myself in your place, to be young as it's all falling apart. And I guess I don't know how, like, I'm having trouble emotionally dealing with it now.
Yeah, I think the thing that I realized as an adult was like, oh, this is how time works. It is all falling apart all the time, you know? Like, I do think that having some sense of historical perspective made me realize, like, oh, people thought the world was ending constantly. Constantly, basically. If you were in, like, you know, sort of regular, like, maybe if you were sort of in the 1% separated from a lot of the bad stuff, maybe you didn't think that. But most people think, oh, okay, yeah, the world's ending constantly. So I guess in a way that makes me feel better, because it's like, no, this is just how humans have operated since, you know, time started, basically. And that's always going to be going on. But it does feel distinctively like things are really bad right now. Like, this is the bad part of the like history that I'm living through right now. This sucks, you know?
Yeah. I was thinking this morning, I'm like, oh, you know, in the wake of the civil rights remix in 2020, the fact that almost, I would say zero, right? At this point, zero police budgets actually decreased. I'm like, oh, you think something would have happened? I'm like, oh, they're beefing them up because they know they can't really do anything to change things for people, but they can beat them down with cops. And I'm like, oh, okay.
Yep, that's how they're gonna play it. Yep, that's what happened in Chicago. Just our mayor added more to the police budget, and things did not get better. Things, in fact, did get worse.
No, I think it's actually scientifically or sociologically proven that more police budgets don't make anyone safer, but they do have more police to hurt people when things are going to get out of control.
Yep.
But do you feel at least somewhat hopeful that you have a progressive mayor now? Are you you're in Chicago?
Yes, I am in Chicago. I'm delighted that Brandon Johnson is imminently going to be mayor. I think the end of this week he starts. I'm stoked. I'm really excited. Because it was close. I really thought, because there's just a lot of like very old sort of you know, they always talk about Chicago's backroom deals, like everyone's just like trying to get their piece of the thing. Correct. That there is a lot of that, especially with like the way that money's divided among aldermanic districts too, and like what the aldermen are putting the money towards, et cetera, et cetera. So I have hope, because like I think Brandon Johnson, you know, he's been in politics enough. He's not like a golden child. Like, he's been there. He knows what's going on. And so I don't think it'll be a situation where it's like, oh, we voted this guy who seems really great. And then, you know, when it comes to it, it's really hard for him to make actual day-to-day decisions. I think he's going to do a good job here, which is great. And kind of just a relief. Like,
so are your parents pretty left-leaning?
Yeah, they are, and have been. I mean, my parents have been, I mean, obviously my mom couldn't vote here until 2001, but my dad has been like a lifelong Democrat. He grew up in Philadelphia, in the city, and so that's just like, I don't think his parents were really that way, and I think that was something that sort of like came because he was born in the 40s and then grew up during the civil rights movement, and just like, you know, experienced like going to Vietnam War protests and stuff like that, and just was like, this is not the world that I would like to live in. And also being like lower middle class too, it's just like, well, it's certainly not benefiting me. So yeah, and they just like are really open-minded. They have very open-minded views, and they're artists. They're like poets and teachers.
Oh, really?
And yeah. They mostly spent their career teaching, but they're both really into poetry and write poems, and that's something that they sort of like bonded over when they met. originally. So, yeah, I think they just like know that. I think they're sort of like, okay, the world is changing at a like kind of intense pace, but they're very open to sort of like I remember having a discussion with my mom about pronouns, you know, like, I think they're just more curious about things than they are sort of like, well, I don't understand that, you know, like those sort of old person yells at cloud thing. So they approach things with curiosity. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. And they're academics. So that, I mean, sorry, it can go either way. I used to be an academic. So it can go, you can either be curious and interested in figuring these things out, or you can be like, I just have to produce enough works that I can get tenure and I can just, you know, fuck around.
Yeah.
Or I'm just a careerist and I just need to pay my mortgage and earn enough to have a summer home or something like that. You can go either of the ways. It doesn't, as I learned very much in my philosophical career, it's not really about the production of interesting philosophical works. It's just about, you know, getting that check sometimes.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, my parents kind of both got the short end of the stick in their careers in that way. And like, my dad was never got tenure because he was like a lecturer. That was just sort of the position he was in, but he was doing definitely a bulk of the work for the department. And he was chair of the department that he taught in for a while. And it was just like kind of a racket. And it was like basically the tenure professors are trying to, you know, get the thing that they want for themselves and are very, just like not very good to the people that aren't able to do that. And so. Yeah.
It's, sorry, I should have also said it's accolades or it's, you know, that summer home or both, right. Hopefully, if you're lucky. You said your dad grew up, I don't know if you didn't say working class, but I'll take that from what you had said.
I didn't specifically say working class. Kind of a mixed background. Like one of his parents, his parents got divorced when he was really young, and so he spent a lot of time with his mom, who was like a secretary, basically, and they moved to the suburbs of Philadelphia. And then his dad actually my grandpa ran like I don't know what you would call it, like a food, like sort of a like large scale food production company. So like during World War II, they were like providing food for troops to take to Europe and stuff like that. So yeah, so it was sort of like, I don't know, he grew up in kind of a situation where he didn't see his dad a lot, and his dad kind of like went and had this sort of other life. But I think they reconciled as adults, because I never met, or I guess I did. I was like 2 when he died. But I don't really remember my grandfather. But he like went and saw my dad when he was doing TOEFL teaching in Japan before I was born. And yeah, I think they were able to like repair their relationship, but it I don't know, it just seemed like it was a little different.
Interesting. I asked that just because I'm like, to go into academia or to want to be a poet, you know, it's riskier if you're coming from that kind of background, I think.
Yeah, I mean, he was a nerd, and I don't know, he just really liked to read. Like my dad talks about, like when he was little, he would just like sit down and read a book and just like get completely lost and just like read for like 6 or 7 hours and not really notice. It was a good way to kind of escape, you know, into another world. And so he was really good at school and really smart, and I think that was part of it. But yeah, I don't know. I actually haven't really talked to him that much about sort of the origin of that specific thing. I think he just loved poetry. He loved theater. He loves them. He's not gone. He's here, but his love of them, I think, is like what kind of drew him to that. And yeah. So I don't know.
I assume they taught at is it University of South? I looked up where you grew up in Carbondale.
I did.
So
yeah.
I looked it up, and I'm like, University of South Illinois is there?
Southern Illinois University.
Southern
Just
Illinois.
reverse it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, they both taught there for a while. My mom they did like I think this was around, no, it was earlier than 2008, before the like crash. It was like 2004 or 5, like beginning of high school. or no, when I was in middle school, earlier than that. So like 2002, she got let go. She was teaching Spanish there because that's her native language. She was teaching Spanish and teaching Spanish like literature and got cut from her department. And so then later she got a job as a high school Spanish teacher and finished her career that way. And it was like a rural high school. It was like 40 minutes away from where we lived. So that was kind of tough, just like the drive. But by that point, like I was in high school and my sister was in middle school, almost high school. So it was like doable. It wasn't like I have to take care of 2 young children and also make this crazy commute every day. So yeah.
Did they meet there?
They did meet there. They met there because my mom came to the United States with her sister who wanted to do a graduate program. And I think my mom's dad, my grandfather, was like, well, I need 2 of you to go together. Like, I can't just send one of you. You got to go in a pair. And so my mom was like, I'll go. And so she also went and did another master's program. She already had a master's degree in Caracas. She was teaching at that time, but one of her sisters was into computer science and wanted to do a program here. And so she came, and then they were both taking English as a second language, which is what my dad taught as a lecturer. That was one of the courses that he taught. And so they met that way, but then after, like, they found out that they both liked poetry. And so, like, after, she had finished the program and gone back to Caracas, they sort of, like, wrote back and forth and, like, sent each other poetry and letters and stuff. And then my dad was like, I think it was, like, my dad just was like, hey, like, can I come to Caracas to see you? And she was like, okay. And then he came and proposed to her. And she was like, oh. But she was like, I don't know, this is wild, but okay.
What year was this? Or it doesn't have to be what year.
This
but
was this was like 1985 or 6. Because she went in 1984. She came over for the master's program. I think it was like 2 years they were here. And then left. And went back
and she chaperone her sister.
Yeah, basically. She was literally, that was basically it. And she, my mom, also a nerd, like, just loved to read, loved literature. She was like, I'm going to be, she's like, I'm just going to be a professor at this university in Caracas. Like, that's what I'm going to do. And she had just been like a lecturer teaching at the time because she had a master's. And then was like, okay, I guess, be cool. At the time, there was a really strong international program at SIU. There were a lot of international students coming through, which is why they had a whole, like, English as a second language department to, like, help with TOEFL testing and stuff like that. And so it was like a center. And so my dad was, like, part of that staff. And then, yeah, that was just, like, part of the thing she took because she had taken English before, I think, but not much. She'd taken really French was her second language. And then just thought, like, this is useful. It's the 80s. Like, that'd be good to do. And, yeah. So.
What was going on in Southern Illinois University that they had such a international, was it like a CIA front? Were they feeding?
No, I think just, like, the state of Illinois had a lot of money at that time. And the like, public universities were really well funded. And there was, like, a big literary community, like John Gardner. I don't know if you know who he is. He was there. There were just, like, a bunch of, like, poets and writers who were like, hey, it's really beautiful here. It's also really cheap to live. And it, it's sort of, I wouldn't call it central, like, I think that Chicago is a really central place in the country because there's, the airport's right there. It's easy to get to. But this was sort of like, if you were kind of a hippie and you were like, I just, like, need something that's, like, really outdoors and, like, beautiful and all this stuff and very inspiring, a lot of people were really interested in that. And so the university was, like, doing great in the 70s, 80s, and in the 90s, pretty much up until, like, the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s. That's when things started to go downhill. And I'm not super, my knowledge on that isn't super granular. It's literally just based on what my parents have, like, told me and what their kind of experience was. But, like, it seems like that's what that was. So,
I mean, could you see that in the city around you?
Yeah.
That things changed?
Oh, yeah. And, like, gosh, it sort of started to feel like economically things were declining when I was in middle school going into high school, like I would just notice it in the mall. Like as a 12, 13-year-old, I spent so much of my time at the mall that was all there was to do. I couldn't drive. So my friend and I would just go to the mall for like hours on the weekend. And we just wander around and we'd notice like, oh, that store closed. Or, oh, they replaced this like store that, used to be a big deal with this like kind of weird, like, I don't know, like, and it just started to get like, there's less and less stuff here. And I know that like malls have declined pretty much everywhere. It's not like exclusively to my town, but like the mall was like the place to go in the 90s. And then suddenly in like the aughts, it was like the mall's dead. There's nothing at the mall. And like even in the last like 3 years, it's really been the last like couple of things. Like our Bed Bath & Beyond is gone. That was the last thing. My dad sent me an article like, look, the Bed Bath & Beyond has finally closed in the mall. Like, yeah, I could definitely watch sort of the decay of everything around me. The Barnes & Noble's still there, though, where I had all the, like, releases for the Harry Potter books when I was in middle school and high school. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Yes. Okay, so at least there's still, for the thing with the mall that I like thinking about now, as you said that, was like, when I was younger, it was bustling. Like, every storefront had something in it.
Yeah.
And I just remember how strange it was if there wasn't something in the storefront, or if it was closed and the gate was down, or if like a store was like, we're opening soon, but because you were there so many times where there was none of that. And so the minute there was one of those things, you're like, oh, this feels off.
Yeah. It feels spooky. It's like sort of like a ghost town kind of vibe, You're like, oh, interesting. What does that mean? And then it started happening more and more frequently where it's like, gosh, it feels like every other one of these little booths is now closed or like coming soon, something else to be determined, like really vague language on a poster. Yeah, that was super weird.
Did your mom have culture shock moving here?
Big time. Absolutely. She didn't, like, this thing with my dad, she has tried to like set the record straight for me a couple of times because she's like, I just need you to know like what the story was. Like, she didn't have any plans to move here, even when she was like chaperoning her sister. I think she was sort of like, the culture's different and like, I don't know if this is really my vibe. So the reason it happened was because she met my dad and they fell in love, and that's just what happened. But she didn't even have like an intention she didn't want to be a citizen. She's like, I'm fine having a green card. This is fine. But then it just got harder and harder whenever I was like with her and we were flying to Caracas, because we went a lot when I was a kid. We'd go like every summer, every Christmas when it was cheaper to fly. And frankly, we had more money. And it was easier to get there. But it was just like coming back through US Customs. They're like, what is this like white blonde baby doing with this lady? Like, and so she was like, it will be easier if I have an American passport and I don't have to split in the line from my like 2 young daughters, like, because they have American passports and it's a separate situation. I think, yeah, it's just like, I hope it's gotten easier to do or better, but at the time it was really like, aliens in one line, everybody else, American citizens in the other line, that's it. So that was complicated. But yeah, I think she still has culture shock. But also, when we go back to Caracas, she says too, like, I also have a little bit of culture shock there. I think it's been long enough. She's lived in this country for like almost 34 years consecutively. And so it's different there too. She kind of feels like she's in 2 places at once, which is how I feel constantly. So in a way, it was nice that we sort of were like, oh, okay, yeah, we both feel this way. It like in different ways, but like the origin of that is very similar. So
when you say in 2 places at once, do you mean like occupying, metaphorically, obviously, occupying 2 spaces at the exact same time and the contradictions that exist between that? Or do you mean kind of I don't know how to say this otherwise, but dialectically bouncing between 2 different states? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Question?
Absolutely. I think honestly, I used to think of it more as the latter, and it definitely, the older I get, the more I recognize it as the former. It's like these two things are always there, and they're sort of always existing at the same time. It's less of like what you're describing that I would think of more as like code switching, you know?
Yeah.
I think that I would probably experience code switching more if I had grown up like in Chicago in a community where it's like sort of insulated, where it's like there were a bunch of Venezuelans around all the time, because I grew up in an area where it was like very Midwestern. You know, it wasn't something where it's like, well, at home we speak Spanish and then out in the world we speak English, which is an experience that a lot of people that I know and I'm friends with have. Mine was sort of like, well, we kind of do both everywhere, you know, like it's just like a constant state of sort of like you're kind of all the things all the time. Yeah, which I think is personally for me feels like a better way to sort of be honest with myself about it, because I don't know, it was really difficult to come to terms with the fact that I do exist in kind of a weird place, and that I don't feel like I'm 100%, you know, you're like all American girl or whatever. And I'm also not like super, I don't feel like 100% authentic Latina all the time. It really is like in an in-between space. And I think just knowing that and like acknowledging that, oh yeah, this is going to feel weird and uncomfortable no matter where you are. Like that just, it's like you're wearing a wool sweater all the time, you know, but you get kind of used to it. You're sort of like, well,
yeah. Are there places you do feel comfortable, or is there a place where you're like, oh, I now feel comfortable in this place? Or is it always just a like vague sense of discomfort that's kind of just like an aura around
oh
you?
Yeah. Well, it's definitely to varying degrees. I mean, I was really lucky that because, and this is sort of related, like because Carbondale and because the university was sort of like the center of the town at that time, because there was such a huge international community, I had a lot of friends who grew up biculturally, you know, like one of their parents was from Taiwan, one of them was from the US, you know, like that kind of sort of thing where it's like a lot of us had like a mom or dad that was a first gen, you know, that was like an immigrant, and like that really helped because it wasn't like I had to explain, you know, like someone comes over to your house, they're just like, oh, this is my mom, and you know, you're just like, oh, cool, yeah, like, you know, it's not like we have like a exact shared cultural dialogue, but it's like that experience is very similar, and it's not like you're bringing in someone who's like, this is weird, you know what I mean? Or like you sort of, things that are happening that are different to you, you're sort of like, cool, yeah, okay, I got it. You just are very observant about that, I think.
There's no like awkward, like if I would go over to a friend's house and I would have to explain some Jewish thing to them or whatever, or I'd have to like, I'd use this as a lie a lot. If I was at a friend's house and they for dinner and they served something I didn't want, I would just say I'm kosher, and they wouldn't know what that meant. So I could just say, well, I don't want whatever that is. And it's not like they understood. And this was before the internet, so they couldn't just Google kosher to like see if the lie worked or not. They were just like, okay, well, I'll just make you some nuggets. And I'm like, yay, because that's what I actually want.
You wanted nuggets. Yeah, that makes sense.
I wanted nuggets.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it was sort of like, this is like a thing that is different from the culture that like we do all share, which is like, we are growing up in the Midwest right now. We are technically all Midwestern. You know what I mean? Like, or whatever other cultural touchstones we have. It's like the differences didn't really like phase people. That was really nice. It wasn't like I had to get into a big explanation or feel uncomfortable because it's like that person doesn't understand, now they're uncomfortable. I feel like in the couple times when that happened, it felt really acute. Like, oh, this person is like uncomfortable because they don't understand something and they don't really know how to ask about it because they haven't been growing up with like this kind of situation their whole lives. And I definitely, as I get older, I have felt like I've been in more situations where that's the case, where I'm like, oh, okay, like when do I bring this up with somebody or whatever? But then when like, you know, I do a performance and someone comes up to me and is like, I love that you sang those songs in Spanish. Like, I've been trying to like, you know, figure out how to like learn or reclaim my own, like, like my parents' native language, and that really spoke to me, and then we can like have a nice little conversation because we have this sort of like shared link of that. Like, that's so nice. So those to me are like safe spaces when I meet people who are like, who have been through some like sort of a similar thing, and it's like we just have this like touch point that's really nice. It's just really important. So yeah,
I get it. I mean, not that exact thing, but I get the kind of being an out group in I grew up Jewish in a very Christian area, so it's just like, okay, are there things that or concepts that you can articulate in Spanish that you have difficulty articulating in English?
Like feelings, or like what do you mean?
Something I always find that different languages carry with them different conceptual capacities. For example, German is very good at combining nouns, so you can come up with like Schadenfreude or whatever, right? That didn't exist in English.
Yeah, totally.
And I'm wondering if there's stuff that you find it easier. Like if you're going to sing a song in Spanish, is there some emotion that you find it easier to articulate that in English it would have been duller or not the right flavor? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Trying to think if I can think of a specific example, but I mean, there have been times when I'm like trying to explain something, or when my mom says something and I explain to like a friend or something, like, oh, she's saying X, and then I explain the literal translation of what she's saying versus like what the essential meaning is. Are there any specific emotions? Because I feel like there's a lot of that. It's just like more illustrative in certain ways. Like, I don't know if there's like, I think that there's like a lot of different emotional depth to it. It wouldn't be exactly like, oh, there's like a word for a feeling that we don't, like in the German way. I wouldn't say it's necessarily just limited to that, but I would say that if you want to say something that is more, or I guess, yeah, actually, if you want to say something that's more evocative of sort of like a feeling that you can't, that is sort of not an in-between feeling, but something that's just that requires a little bit more specificity, like, yes, the word to like sort of like show something off. Like, it means a really specific thing. It's like saying like you're sort of like flaunting something, but it's not quite that. It's like you want to like show it to the world, and you're just sort of like displaying yourself in a really specific way, and you feel good about it. Like, it's not like meant to be sort of like you're displaying your wealth or it's arrogant. It's like you feel great about yourself, and you want to like show people how good you feel about yourself. Like,
it's internal versus like flaunting is external,
right?
Whereas this is more internal.
It's more, it's more how you feel about yourself. So yeah, I'm trying to think of like other situations where that plays, because there's a bunch of like kind of funny expressions for things, like,
sure.
But I think that's something that I'm also just sort of digging into, is like writing in Spanish. Most of the songs that I've written have been in English, and then a lot of the new ones that I've been writing are a combination of English and Spanish. So, there's been a point where I feel compelled to like insert something in Spanish, and it's been tough to kind of triangulate on why, So that's interesting. I'll think about that more. I'll try to pay attention.
Does it just feel right when you want to go into it? It just
feels right. Yeah, I definitely don't want it to feel forced. Like, oh, and now I'll switch. Like it just, it just, for whatever reason, it just feels right, or it sounds better in that language. Like it just sounds better in that language, or I don't know. There's got to be some internal thing that my brain is doing subconsciously where it's like, this is where you would want to say this in a different way.
Yeah. Well, there's also, I would think, the flow of the language. Mm-hmm. There's something probably deep that I don't have the ability to articulate or the words for, but that in however the language sounds, like when you think of German, you do think of like techno, or you think of like kind of like a rougher, because of the way the language is. It seems rougher than, say, French or Spanish.
Yeah.
And then English is somewhere in between those. And, there's something, it probably on a gut level feels more, there are certain things, either the phrasing of the lyrics or whatever, where it feels more natural in one language versus the other.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that, like, a lot of times when I'm trying to punctuate something, maybe English would make more sense because there's a lot of sort of like hard sounds and stops. And then Spanish is super melodic most of the time when you say it, like the words tend to just like have a different rhythm, and you can definitely like make that work for whatever it is that you're trying to convey musically in a song, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, I was in my head. I was just thinking of like the new Deerhoof album is all in Japanese.
Right.
I was trying to think of the way that Satomi sings that and how that matches the music, and I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't have any kind of actual interesting thing to say about it. I was just thinking that was just what was going on in my brain at that moment. But I'm asking all this stuff because I think what is interesting, and I don't know if you thought about this, is that you grew up with this kind of dual consciousness.
Yeah.
And I'm curious how that influences the things you make, or how that influenced your development as a person.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I have talked about this a lot, where like the name of the project and the whole thing that it's sort of like about isn't like a conclusion that I came to. It's like a thing it's like a journey that I'm currently on. And so I think that part of the experience of like writing music for me and writing lyrics is sort of like thinking about that really intensely. Like, the EP I released in January, I felt like a lot of what I was writing was really about this internal experience that you're talking about, and sort of like that duality, like where is that coming from? Like, why is this happening and how? And it is a lot of like looking at the past in that way. Because I would say that like up until, I was in college or like right out of college, I didn't think about it all that much. It was just something that sort of was like a thing that was part of my life, and that was it. And then like at times I would have a little bit of friction with it in different ways, but it was sort of just like, oh, but this is just like the way my brain works. Mm-hmm. And like the exposure isn't, I think that's been the difficult thing for me, is realizing like, similarly to everything's just sort of like existing in the same thing all the time, and it's not really a back and forth. That still doesn't mean that it's like an equal exchange. And I think it's been interesting to kind of look at that and just be sort of like, oh, interesting that like, I think about this kind of stuff in English, or like I sometimes have dreams in Spanish, or like, that kind of stuff, like where the different cultural aspects of who I am show up and where they don't show up, and like why they're showing up at certain times and things like that. It's just like, once you start to like latch onto that, it feels like constantly you're noticing like, oh, interesting. Like I say ope every 5 freaking seconds when I like knock into something. Like, yeah, that's regular. Yeah.
What changed in college?
I think it's just like a time when, I was like away from home. I'd lived in the same town my whole life. I have a lot of friends that moved around a lot as kids. And so I think just like being completely out of my element, being in, frankly, an element where I felt like an outsider, but in a completely different way. Like I got a scholarship to go to University of Chicago, which was a big deal. Mm-hmm. That was crazy. And like, I did not know what I was going to experience in terms of like who else was going there, and like what their background was, like what their education was. And I felt like an old timey farmer. I felt like a country bumpkin, to be completely honest. And I felt like I didn't belong there. Like I wasn't smart enough to be there. And that was something that I had to sort of overcome. And I think that out of that process, there was just like a lot of looking inward, like, who am I? What am I doing? Like, why do I want the things that I want? And I think through that, I just sort of like started to devise like a sense of myself as a person.
How did you work through that process? Was it literally just thinking through it, or did you go to therapy? Like, what was going on that you were able to kind of work these things out?
I didn't go to therapy. I think what I did was like, part of it was sort of finding a community. I was really involved in theater when I was in college. It was something I was involved in high school. I'd sort of put myself on a little bit of a hiatus for music. I'd been playing music my whole life until that point. I took piano lessons. I played the saxophone in band. I was really involved in marching band when I was in high school. And so I was sort of tired of that. But like, I found a bunch of weirdos in theater, and like, it did feel like there was more sort of like the variety of people and experiences that I was looking for there. And so that was really helpful. And also just like acting as a thing was like a way to sort of like, I don't know, work through this like inner turmoil. I felt like, I don't know who I am, but I know who this character is and how to play them. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't realize at the time that like sort of putting on a costume and being in a different mode was actually helping me sort of like settle some of the internal turmoil I had inside. So, yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. I try to, I have friends that are actors. My wife is an actor, but she's also a stand-up. And I think one of the things, she has such a sense of her own voice that I think she has difficulty subsuming that under a character. And I wonder if people who don't have a sense of their own voice, like a Peter Sellers type, who like there was nothing inside him.
Just a husk.
If he, seriously, from all reports, there was some anecdote about he was on the set of Doctor Strangelove as he was playing the president that day, and his mother came to visit, and they had lunch, and afterwards she ran into Kubrick, and he was like, "Oh, how was lunch with your son?" And she's like, "I don't know. I had lunch with the president." Like, the guy was just not. There was just nothing else besides whatever character he's playing. But that's interesting that like, if you're trying to figure out your sense of self, that you can that there's some kind of refuge in playing a character.
Yeah, it did feel sort of like, oh, this is like so straightforward, like,
right.
And
was it straight plays or musicals or both?
I only acted in straight plays. I eventually switched. I stopped acting as much, and I got really into design. I was really interested in stage design. I did a lot of costume design, and like dabbled in lighting, because the theater department of the University of Chicago is very like, do whatever you want. It's not like Northwestern where it's like really intense and hyper competitive. It was kind of great in that it was sort of like, you guys can make this department whatever you want it to be, and that was awesome because I got to try a bunch of different stuff. And so eventually I stopped doing that, but I did do like design for musicals. And I think I also found like a different kind of refuge in that, like sort of trying out different creative processes and hats. And that really, I think about that time a lot as like creating who I am as an artist. Cause like, I feel like I have an artistic process and like, viewpoint because of that, because of doing theater there, for sure.
What exactly, or what specifically was it that helped you sharpen, or that allowed you to sharpen, what was the process of doing theater, of doing set design that gave you the tools to then have an artistic process when it came to writing music?
Well, it's a lot more process based. So like if you're preparing for a role, there's like, a number of things that you have to do that, like to access certain emotions or to like physically be able to embody a character. I just think that there's sort of like or it seems to me like more clear-cut ways of doing it. And there's a bunch of different ways to do that process. Like we had Tina Landau come in and teach us about like viewpoints, and like, like Anne Bogart came and did a workshop. Like it was crazy. It was like amazing because it was like, these are all of these things that seem like they have nothing to do with the art that you're making, but they have everything to do with it. Like you can learn so much about like how to physically become something or become someone else from this process. You can learn about like what the intent behind words is. You can learn how to respond to other people like in a situation. So that was really helpful. And then from a stage design standpoint too, it was sort of like reading the text over and over, like getting really dramaturgical with things and just being like, what do all of these things signify? How can I underline some of the like themes in this play? Like, how can I bring certain things out with the color of the wash on stage, or with like the color of someone's dress, or the texture of something, or like, how do we make this sort of feel apocalyptic, or whatever it is that, you know, like you're sort of working with other people trying to figure out like, what is this play? What do we want it to say? What do we want it to mean? That going through that process, like on your own and with other people, is just super helpful. When you're doing it with music, it can feel so interior. That process, I think, and especially because like we sort of idealize the sort of like, you know, inspiration just hits and then you write a hit song and like the rock star lifestyle. There are a lot of people who have like really specific artistic craft, but I see it talked about less in music, especially like popular music or indie music, than I see it talked about in theater, where it's like, that's all we're fucking talking about is process, you know? And that is something that I just held on to. Like, I mean, I feel like I go through like cycles of how I'm writing or what I'm writing or what it is or what I'm doing. But I always try to go back to like, okay, what's my process? And the times when I feel the most unmoored artistically, it's like I've lost track of like what I'm doing and why, you know? Sometimes it's like, I'm just going to draw something every day. Seems completely unrelated to doing anything musically. But those kinds of exercises have like helped my brain in ways that can't be quantified. And I think that those sort of like exercises and different like modes of like, I'm not, you know, writing actively, but I am doing like recording and editing, just like knowing what needs to happen when and how your brain works. That stuff is what I really learned, I think, in theater that I've been able to apply in like a crazy amount of ways as a songwriter.
Yeah. No, I agree. My dumb version of it is, okay, maybe I'm not writing today, but I just edited a podcast, and having to put it together and think through, you know, like, because it's on Zoom, sometimes there's a latency. And so if I want it to sound like a conversation, I literally have to make cut, and kind of smush it together a little bit.
Yeah.
Because of that latency. And it even though it's not writing, it still keeps that part of the brain kind of engaged. And so then the next day when I go to sit down and write, I'm not starting from zero.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. It's like you can't be doing the same thing the same way or have the same approach every day, because you'll sort of like run out of battery with certain things. And in order to fill it up, you have to do something else. Like, yeah, definitely.
Did you have an ambition to be a musician? If I could describe your look to the audience, it was like a smushed up face of like both contemplating and kind of just like a tinge of disgust, maybe,
or panic. Like, I think I felt panic when so I'll add that in there. Yeah, I mean, yes, I have always thought of myself as a musician in the sense that like I am one in my life. But I think if you're talking about like capital M musician, like making a career out of it, I think part of my like sort of like panic disgust response is because I just have no idea where the industry is going. It is like very tedious and difficult most of the time.
Yeah.
And like but the thing is that like I love making music. Like if I could never show it to anybody ever again, I would still do it. Like I need to have it. It is a thing that like my brain will do when it's in off mode, you know? Like so yeah, like I want that, but I am also aware that like there's just a lot of, I don't know, life is big and complicated, and there's a lot of factors that are out of my control about like if I can like make it as a musician, but I will always be one, regardless of what that is. Like even if I have to keep working a day job, you know, every day while I do it, which I think I may have to do that.
Yeah. I think when I talk to musicians more than any other not, I was going to say occupation, any other creative path on this show, it is, unless you started 20 years ago or more,
Yeah.
it is a very difficult path to make a living on. I mean, any creative path at this point is very, like, I mean, Naomi and I do, she's an actor, she's a stand-up. We both have podcasts. We both write. Just to make a normal living in this industry. So,
Yeah.
I mean, Damon from Galaxy 500 has a newsletter called Dada Almanac, which is great. And, you know, a lot of the topics are about how difficult it is between streaming and every other thing, as capitalism kind of just like as the iron jaws clench around all of us, how difficult it is. I don't think I meant ambition in terms of necessarily capitalistic ambition. I just meant, like, was there a spark in you when you were younger?
Yeah.
Where you were like, this is what I want to do, regardless of like what the financial outcomes are, whether it's a occupation or not. This is just part of me and I'm going to follow it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I also like came to that conclusion multiple times. Like the first time I ever played a piano, I was like, this is insane. Like, this is amazing, you know? And I just like, it was one of the things that could really keep me engaged fully. Like, I don't think I've ever been bored making music. And I can't really say that about pretty much anything else. Like, it is just one of those things where my brain is just like, and then this comes next, and then you do this. And like, it's just like one of those things.
Is it the process? Is when you said, like, you sat down at the piano, sorry, it really, like, something went off in my head. And I was playing guitar yesterday and I lost track of time. And it was the first time in a while that I had done something where I lost track of time like that, where I was in the flow. And when you said you sat down at the piano, I'm like, oh, I wonder if that's some of the magic of it. But then you talked about process. And when I think of process, it seems a little less in a present state. But I don't know. I'm kind of curious. Was it when you sat down at the piano that first time, was it just kind of like being in the flow and being present? Or was there something else about it that kind of captured you?
I think part of it was that, and I think part of it was that it just felt like something that came really naturally to me. Like, I think I just, you know, not to like toot my own horn or whatever, but like I just had a really natural aptitude for recognizing harmonies and recognizing like melodies and stuff. And I just think that it was something where I was like, oh, that's interesting. Like, but what if I did this with it? You know, it was just one of those things where you add more layers and you're sort of like, interesting. So I think part of it is the process though, because I think you can still have a process for something and still get completely lost in it. You know, when I'm recording, that's when I feel the most like I'm getting lost. When I'm just like demoing stuff and adding things, and then I have another idea, and then I'm like, but what if I do this? And then I like get it all set up, and then I try it out, and I'm like, oh, okay, not exactly right. And then I try it a different way, and then suddenly I look up, and it's like 8 hours later, you know? Like,
yeah. The minute I said it, I regretted saying it, because I'm like, no, Andy, when you're like, if you're recording a song or something like that, and you have to like, now you have to connect this wire, because it's all done in this small, you know, office studio thing here. And then now I have to bring over the MIDI keyboard and find a Surface to put that on. And then it's like 3 hours later and you didn't realize that 3 hours had gone past. So I misspoke.
No, that's okay. But it is hard to see that because like, I think you're right. Like the driving thing is like, it doesn't matter how long all that other stuff takes because you're like, no, but I have this idea and I have to see it to its conclusion or to wherever it leads next. And that's what is like the driving force through like, I'll do all the MIDI keyboard bullshit to get through that, to do this, you know?
Yeah. Did you ever see your parents kind of lost in the flow when you were younger? Was there something that captured them?
I don't know. I don't know if I ever noticed. I was such a like, I don't know. I had so many ideas as a child and so many like things that I was doing with my sister, like games that were super elaborate storylines that we were playing that like if they were lost in something, it was probably very quiet and internal, and because they're not musicians like I love my parents, but they're both tone deaf. They just like they love music. They love music. But they have never played instruments and don't, really have the aptitude for it. But yeah, I think like for writing, it's a little bit more of a like internal thing. Although my dad did have a lot of Post-it notes on his computer. Maybe that was what that was. Just like flurry of Post-it notes with ideas. I still find some of them sometimes. So maybe that could be it.
I get it. The number of lists I have and Post-it notes that I've cleaned it up a little bit recently, but just like papers. Then you got notes in Gmail, notes on your phone, note everywhere.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of like the digital equivalent of having Post-it notes.
For sure.
So yes, I understand that feeling. Yeah. I get that. Like, I don't know why for me at least, music, even though it's not what I really do, it's easier to get lost in that than it is to get lost in a script. Because the script, I don't know, when you're playing, I don't know if this is what it's like for you. I'm just trying to like put myself in this space, but like when I'm playing, it's like, there are no rules for how you write a song, but with a script, even though it's not like, I don't know, there's rules that I think bad writers follow, but there really are no rules except for the fact there is a format. So every time I start a new scene, I still have to write interior or exterior blank. And then I have to like think like, oh wait, where is this? Okay. And it like stops, like every time you start a new scene, it kind of stops you a little bit. Or every time you're just like, wait, how do I format this dialogue? How do I write a text? If someone's texting someone, how do I do that? And I think, whereas if you're writing a song, there's no, like, obviously you can follow verse, chorus, verse, but it doesn't jar you out of it as you are. It doesn't jar me out of it. I don't want to speak for you or other people. Yeah, no, it doesn't jar me out of it.
That's interesting. Like the sort of like, oh, because of the way that I need to format this, it's sort of like, like cutting me off right when I'm trying to just get somewhere. I think there are times when that happens when you're writing a song. Like, I'm definitely mostly a lyrics first, music second person. So if I have lyrics that I've done and I'm sort of like, okay, well, what if I just pick this sort of like simple 3-chord combination and just see what happens when I try to like figure this out. If it's not right, then it's like you have to stop immediately and think like, oh, okay, actually, should the time for this be different? Or like, should the should the sort of range for the notes be different? Like, should the key be different? So there are ways where that can kind of happen. But once you get there, once you sort of are like, oh, this is just sort of happening. And I'll usually just like have a setup to record and be recording that whole process of me like stumbling through trying to figure out what is this. But once you get there, it's really rewarding, but it can just like take a while. Like it's sort of I don't know, there's a little bit more of an on-ramp to that.
Yeah.
That you struggle with.
Yeah. No, I get that. If you're like, okay, this, and now F sharp minor, and you're like, nope, not that. And now you're like, all right, then what about B minor? All right, nope, not that. And there's this kind of, I guess with the way my brain works though, there isn't that kind of like, I'm not actually like naming these chords in my head and then playing them. My hand's just going to the next chord and trying and seeing how that feels. Yeah. I think maybe there's something more experiential in that than there is in the like tap tapping on the keyboard.
That makes sense because you can just sort of be like, oh, wrong chord. Like, what if I try half a step up or whatever? You're right. Like, it's easier to just sort of like change directions in that situation for sure.
Just to like, we're at the very end. Sorry, I know we're going just slightly over, but I'm just curious. Like, what is leading up in your life to you're like, okay, I want to be a musician. Whatever that means. Doesn't have to mean in the capitalist career sense necessarily. Like how is this actually emerging from you as opposed to it just being like a want you have and you're like, oh, that would be nice. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, walking away from it was really helpful. I think because like I was a musician starting from the time I was 6 until the time I was 18, and I had done it in this really kind of specific way that was just sort of laid out for me. Like I didn't really act. I mean, I chose to like play the saxophone, and there was choices that I made, but mostly it was like there's a band program at the school, you know, you can join it, etc. I kind of felt like I didn't know what I wanted out of music at the end of that, and taking a break and sort of like learning how to be an artist in college instead of like being a musician was really helpful at sort of making me realize like, oh, actually now I know how to approach this from a completely different way. And because I was also really into poetry. I did like a dual degree in theater and English, but my emphasis was on poetry. Like, I then was like, okay, I feel like I have all the tools that I'd need. If I wanted to start writing music again, I could do it. And then I started doing it, and then I was like, this is actually it. And I had to go through all of this bullshit to get there. Mm-hmm. But like, it just was like the result of like coming at things from completely different angles, or like trying different kinds of art to really get to a point where it was like, this is actually the thing, you know? Like, I didn't want to be a theater artist in a like deep inside of me sense or in a professional sense. I wanted to be, but I knew I wanted to like write songs and make songs and be a musician. Like, music was like the thing for me. And I think I just had to like kind of lose my way a little bit and then find my way back to it. And that's kind of when I knew, like, I was like 22, 23. I was like, this is actually it for me. I think this is the thing.
Was that an overt, articulated thought in your head? Or do you think it was just like you kind of naturally, you had done this other stuff and you kind of naturally gravitated back towards music?
I had started to naturally gravitate back towards it. But when I had basically like bought a really simple recording rig, like I had started playing with a group just doing covers on my college campus. We actually would open for the improv team like at UC. It was really fun. But doing that made me sort of realize like, I really love music and I feel like I could write my own songs now. And I started doing that, and then I started recording them with like really basic equipment. I was like interning with this sound artist, just like learning about how recording works. And yeah, once I started to grab all these things, then I would spend hours just like recording these songs and writing these songs. And that was kind of like the real moment where I was like, this is what I want to do. This is it.
Wow. That actually seems like a very nice place to end. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you so much. This was so nice. Yeah, this was a great, like, it was just like a nice conversation. I really enjoyed it.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh, bye, oh, bye, oh, bye, oh, bye, oh, bye.